afternoon, and thank you for connecting with the Pennsylvania Game Commission today. My name is Lori, and my colleague Brittany and I will be managing this session today. We are fortunate to be joined today by Ben Jones, the Habitat Division Chief for the Pennsylvania Game Commission. He'll be talking to us about fire's role in Pennsylvania ecosystems. We expect the presentation to last about 25 or 30 minutes, followed by a question and answer period of about 10 to 15 minutes. You can ask a question by typing into the Type Question Here box on the GoToWebinar control panel at the right of your screen. For those of you dialing in to listen by phone today, please note that this is not a toll-free call and you may receive long-distance charges from your service provider. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Ben. Thanks for joining us today, Ben. Would you like to share a little bit about your background with folks before you get started?
My pleasure, Lori. My name is Ben Jones, and I'm the Habitat Division Chief with the Pennsylvania Game Commission. And in that role, I oversee statewide habitat management programs for the agency on both public and private lands. And part of that responsibility, I'm fire program manager for the Game Commission. I grew up in Pennsylvania, but after attending Penn State, went to grad school in southern Mississippi, and then worked in East Tennessee and western North Carolina. And I actually was working on some projects looking at wildlife responses to use of prescribed fire and using prescribed fire to improve habitat. So with that experience and coming back home to Pennsylvania, brought a lot of those ideas about the use of prescribed fire for habitat improvement back. And that's what we're going to talk about here on our lunch break together today. And prescribed fire proponents and fire managers really have their work cut out getting the word out about the good use of fire. Of course, we're up against one of the most successful marketing campaigns ever undertaken in history with Smokey Bear. As far as recognition, everybody knows Smokey, and everybody knows the message. You know, only you can prevent forest fires. Well, luckily we do have Smokey on our corner now trying to get the word out about prescribed fire. So this is from Forest Service website, and prescribed fires are good fires. So Smokey's helping deliver this new message. And this is a great summary, and I'll actually read a little bit from this to give you a brief introduction to prescribed fire. So also known as controlled burn, refers to controlled application of fire by a team of experts, safely reducing excessive amounts of brush, shrubs, trees, what we collectively call fuel. Helps reduce catastrophic damage of wildfire on our lands. An effective tool in preventing outbreak and spread of wildfires, but also very important for ecosystem management. We're going to talk a lot about that today. So I'll discuss with you briefly the landscape context of what we're doing here in Pennsylvania. And on the map there you can see the distribution of our state game land system, which is 1.5 million acres on over 330 tracts. And there's a game lands in all but 2 counties, Philadelphia and Delaware, across the state. And the state game land system is unique in that it's a land base that is managed by an independent wildlife agency. So in that we have a pretty specific mandate to create and maintain public hunting special reserves. Essentially, we have a mandate to manage for wildlife conservation and hunting opportunity on that 1.5 million acres. And you can see the map above. I'll add our other public lands, and these are state public lands in Pennsylvania, which is unique. Our state forests, we do have about a 500,000 acre Allegheny National Forest in the Northwest, state parks, Nature Conservancy ground. We have a large National Guard training center. So these are other public landowners with various missions relevant to ecosystem management, wildlife conservation, and recreation. And these other public landowners in Pennsylvania are also interested in the use of prescribed fire for ecosystem management. And one of the ecosystems we'll focus on today are oak and oak pine habitats. And to give you an idea of context, we have about 800,000 acres of our 1.5 million, so over half of our land base is in an oak or oak pine type of habitat. And if you look at that acreage on the game lands and on our state forest land as well, you're over 1.7 million acres in these oak and oak pine habitats. So as we go through the discussion about ecosystem restoration here, that's quite a large land base just on the public lands alone. So talking about the oak ecosystems, briefly tell you about fire's role in maintaining those ecosystems. This was a document that came out 2 years ago this summer, and it essentially synthesizes what we know about fire and oak ecosystems. And over the past 3 or 4 decades, as far as research funding and research projects into forest management and forest health, the issue with oaks has been far and above the most studied forest health issue out there. And the problem has been that we're finding in a lot of places that we're not replacing our oak forests. So when oak forests are cut or damaged by gypsy moth or whatever, we're not getting oak forests back. And the culmination of that research really tells us that fire is extremely important. And actually, when you look at this document, there are over 300 citations here, and you walk away realizing that if you're going to maintain oak forests, fire is going to need to be a part of that ecosystem. So briefly, why is it that fire and oaks go together? Well, of course, oaks produce acorns, and you end up with some seedlings that are hiding out on the forest floor. And they're hanging out down there waiting for an opportunity to become canopy trees. So a gap created from wind throw or tree mortality, whether it's timber harvest or gypsy moth mortality or whatever, then these seedlings are in a position to grow up and replace that oak forest with the next oak forest. The problem is there are other species, tree seedlings, that are on the forest floor with those oaks. So I've got this bar graph for you here, and if we look at the blue lines, this is seedling counts without fire. So we'll look specifically here at the oak and the maple line. So without fire, here's our number of oak seedlings. It's double, almost triple the number of seedlings in maple. So if something were to happen to the overstory of this forest, these seedlings at this point would make up the new forest. And what would that forest then be made up of if something happened to the overstory right here? I can hear you through the Ethernet cable saying it would be a maple forest, which is absolutely right. And this is what we've been seeing in our oak forests over the past several decades, that the new forest is an oak, but it's dominated by things like maple. Now, this was data collected in the same area after one fire, and we can see that our oak is still right here, but we've balanced the playing field and knocked the amount of maple back. So if something were to happen to our forest canopy after this fire, then we'd have a forest that's better balanced between oak, which maintains dominant. And we're not getting rid of all the maple and all the other species, but oak is maintaining its dominance. And that's with just one fire. I'll show you here quickly kind of how that operatively how that works. So you do have these oak seedlings on the ground together with some of their competitors. And this is a prescribed fire, and take note, we'll talk more about this, but the low intensity, low flames. But along with our oak seedlings out through here, we also have striped maple, maple, and birch. So this low intensity fire moving through this forest stand is going to top kill all of those seedlings. And it's going to top kill the oaks too, but where the oaks have a competitive advantage is they have this very deep taproot storing up reserves. So after that oak seedling is top killed, it has enough reserves then to go ahead and resprout and grow another oak seedling. And they actually grow very quickly after fire. This is different than how species like maple, other fire intolerance respond. So this is how fire gives oak a competitive advantage. It's a stronger resprouter after fire goes through. This is also an excerpt from that fire synthesis document, and this goes beyond oak forests. And this is something I've really had an interest in, this ecological restoration. And if you look at the caption beside the picture of this open oak woodland, it says, an open oak woodland created by repeated prescribed fire, diffuse shade, diverse herbaceous layer, two conditions that were sometimes described by early European settlers. So that's important when we're thinking about this restoration context and restoring oak woodlands. Another neat picture from that same document about oak savannas, and mentioning here that in eastern North America, oak savannas only occupy a small fraction of their historic range. So open habitats like this used to be much more prevalent across the Appalachian landscape and here in Pennsylvania as well. Here are a few examples of what these oak ecosystems, often on ridgetops here in Pennsylvania, what they would have looked like. So open-grown savanna conditions. You can see where the first European settlers were calling these open areas park-like conditions. So we're interested in restoring these communities, and I'll give you several reasons why in a little bit. But before we can go into restoration, we need to understand more about them historically. What was their structure? How often did fires burn through these areas? Were there fire-free periods? So if we're going to restore these ecosystems with fire, we need to know a little bit more about them. So to get to some of those answers, we entered into a collaborative project with the University of Missouri Tree Ring Lab, Mike Stambaugh, Joe Marshall, Rich Guyette. And we're looking at reconstructing these historical fire regimes in Pennsylvania. Also cooperating with several folks from the Forest Service, Dan Day, Pat Brose from here in Pennsylvania as well. So we've selected multiple sites across Pennsylvania's ecoregions where oak communities are dominant. And this is really cool. It's one of the neatest research studies I've ever been involved in. Actually going out through the woods and finding these old stumps and snags. And if you spend any time in the woods, no doubt you've walked by these things. You may not have noticed them. I know that I certainly didn't before getting out in the woods with these guys from Missouri. But these are the treasure trove out there, and these things are like historical documents. And if we look at just the one face of this old snag, each of those arrows is pointing to a recorded fire event historically. And so that when we cut a cross section out of these old pine snags around the forest floor, they actually can be dated back into the 1600s and even the 1500s. And you can see this one was dated, and each of those dates and arrows represents a historic fire. So we can get an idea here in restoring these ecosystems, how often did fires burn through them historically? And on this particular site, it was about every 4 to 6 years or so. That's how frequent fire was burning across this ridgetop. Something of particular interest here is 1755, 56, 57, and 58. We actually had annual fires back to back to back. So this starts to tell us a little something about the ecosystem structure. To be able to carry fires annually like that, you would have had to have some kind of grass understory. So it starts to tell us not only about how often fires occurred, but gives us a picture of what the vegetation structure was there. And seeing annual fires really leads us to be certain that these were savannas, like we know used to occur across eastern North America. Just some of the data here from 2 game lands where we've been doing this fire history study, and there will be many more to come. I think we're up to about 9 sites now. But you can see here, dating back on this site to 1538, and this was the mean interval between fires. So fires were burning very frequently across that landscape. Now it's important to note here was the range, so the longest period between fires was about 37 years, you can see here. Well, on each of these sites, they haven't seen fire for 100 to 125 years. So never before have these oak ecosystems, oak and pine habitats, seen such a long fire-free period as we've imposed on it now with fire suppression. So this isn't, of course, in our mandate, wildlife conservation is very important. So in our state wildlife action plan, which gives us a blueprint for managing sensitive birds and mammals, our species of greatest conservation need in the state. Our first wildlife action plan was done around 2005. And in that plan, it actually cited fire exclusion as a major threat to key habitats. So keeping fire out of those habitats where they used to burn frequently is resulting in drastic habitat changes, and it's a major threat to a lot of species. Taking a look at some data across North America, actually, 70% of North American early successional birds are in decline, and this is a proportion of species that are declining, so you don't want to have a high bar here. But if we look at the high bars highlighted in yellow, species that depend on grasslands, shrub, scrub, and savanna-type habitats, more of them are in decline than not, especially when you compare them to the forest species and generalists. So this is a result of losing a lot of those savanna and shrubby habitats that would have been maintained by disturbances like fire. So it is a significant wildlife conservation issue that we need to address. Just some data here from some of these species that depend on these frequently disturbed habitats. Here's an example, whippoorwill, and whippoorwills absolutely love recently burned areas. It's kind of, in a lot of cases, instant gratification when you burn, and in a very short time period you'll find whippoorwills there. This is the first breeding bird atlas data, and each of those points represents where whippoorwills were found. This was the second breeding bird atlas. So you can see a major contraction in the number and location of whippoorwills, a species that depends on these kind of habitats. Another one that's a candidate for federal endangered species listing, the golden-winged warbler. So this is the first breeding bird atlas here in the early 80s to the late 80s, and then the most recent breeding bird atlas in Pennsylvania here. So you can see, similar to whippoorwills, a major contraction in where they're found. And this is habitat related without question for these species. So it's not just about birds and mammals. There are a lot of invertebrates, lepidopterans especially. Here's a list of just a few. But we did a research project with our partners at the Nature Conservancy and found 384 moth species, 7 of which are state listed, that were found only on these sites that were being restored with prescribed fire. So there's a lot of diversity here. On that note, I will mention we've done some monitoring with ticks on a burn area in Center County near State College. This has been shown in other places, especially in the south, with potential to reduce ticks with prescribed burning. So in spring 2010, the year of the burn, we had 88% reduction in the number of ticks in the burn area. And this carried on into the fall. We were still at 75% reduction. And even into the next spring, we were still over half the number of ticks in the areas that were burned. So you could see if you had a return interval of 2, 3 to 5 years, you could significantly impact the number of ticks that are in an area. I will mention the Prescribed Fire Council. I'll give you a little bit about the nuts and bolts of prescribed fire, laws pertaining to prescribed fire, and a little bit about how it's done. So here in Pennsylvania, kind of the networking hub for our people interested in using prescribed fire, that hub is the Pennsylvania Prescribed Fire Council. And it reviews any proposed changes to our state standards for operating prescribed fire. We provide training, sponsor courses, and public outreach is something really important too, to get the word out to the public about these good fires, about how prescribed fire can be used to restore ecosystems and reduce the risk of wildfire. So the Pennsylvania Prescribed Fire Council, its first order of business was to work on some law changes in Pennsylvania. The law, as it was prior to 2009, had serious liability consequences for anyone engaged in prescribed burning, both civilly and criminally. So the Prescribed Fire Council worked with the legislature to remove that criminal and civil liability for those lawfully engaged in prescribed fire. So House Bill 262 went out in July of 2009, We did a lot of work with educating the legislature about how prescribed fire is done, about its importance and management across the landscape. And this may be hard to believe, but it was voted on, unanimously approved in July of 2009. And there haven't been many unanimous votes in the House, but this, we're proud to say this was one of them. So the Prescribed Burn Practices Act, as it's known, set the standards for using prescribed fire here in PA. What has to go into a burn plan? There are a lot of planning requirements. What's the review process for those burn plans? To lead a burn or to be in a leadership role on a burn, what are your credentials? Both from qualifications and experience, what are the training standards? So these things were all defined in the Prescribed Burn Practices Act. If you want that criminal and civil liability protection, then you need to be following all these guidelines. And so some more about the nuts and bolts of prescribed fire. This is a document that was put out by the Nature Conservancy. I think it's a really good way to kind of give you a general breakout of how prescribed fire is done in a stepwise fashion. So number one, here you have some kind of a fire break, whether it's a road or a stream or a water body. And this is the wind direction here. So we begin these fires lighting a backing fire, we call it, against the wind near this break. So the fire moves very slowly against the wind and creates what we call our black line. So this is the widening our safe area and our efforts to make sure this fire stays under control. So this is our backing fire, creating this black safe zone. And then once we have a large black safe zone, then we start lighting additional fires ahead to pull the whole thing together. Now you can see the way these firing patterns are done, and with that slow backing fire, it provides safety for our crews so that nobody's getting trapped in there, but it also provides escape points for wildlife. We get a lot of questions about that. You know, are wildlife harmed during these fires? This is very different than a wildfire that's running out of control, because you do have escape points as we're progressing, as we're working through here, for wildlife to get out of harm's way. Just a few pictures here of prescribed fires. And an important part of the planning process is that we pick the days when we light these fires. So if you have extremely high winds and low humidities, we're not lighting these fires because they can't be safely controlled under those conditions. Unlike a wildfire, which starts on those very kinds of days. I mean, as you can see here, you know, we chose to light this fire on a day when we had snow surrounding the burn unit, so that really helps with our control. But this is very different than the things, of course, that we see in the news, especially here lately with the wildfires in Alberta. Quite different fire behavior when we pick the day and the method for burning versus a wildfire situation. So this, of course, is Alberta, but certainly we have these same things occurring in Pennsylvania. This is a news headline from last year in Carbon County. This year we had one of our largest wildfires ever here in Pennsylvania, right around 10,000 acres in the Poconos. Structures were lost, and well over $1 million spent controlling a wildfire up in that area. So I don't want to underestimate the ability for us to mitigate the danger of wildfires by having a prescribed fire program, by going in there on the days that we choose and reducing that buildup of brush and grasses, what we refer to as fuels, and reducing the opportunity for a large uncontrolled wildfire. So as I start to wrap things up here, for those of us interested in conservation that grew up in Pennsylvania, Ned Smith is something we all grew up with. I just thought this is really neat because this area where Ned Smith is describing is actually one of our restoration sites of about 6,000 acres where we're actively using a lot of fire. So here, this was October 1962, Ned Smith was talking about driving past a burned area. And he mentions, I've never seen a burned over forest that didn't become a whitetail haven. True in time, these fire blackened hills are overgrown with succulent plants, that doesn't explain why deer begin frequenting such places almost before the smoke settles. So I did mention about wildlife being able to get out of the burn areas, but they really want back in there very quickly. And oftentimes while we're patrolling after a fire, we'll see turkeys and deer right back in those burned areas, quite literally before the smoke is even settled. So it's something that wildlife are used to. They evolved with fire on the landscape, and it's just not something that bothers them, and they seem to want to get back in these areas. So I'll show you a couple pictures now of some of the restoration work we've done, and we can do this with whitetails in mind, actually. This is a ridgetop area right where, near where Ned Smith would have been talking about over 50 years ago. So fire hasn't been on this landscape in about 60 to 75 years, and you can see it's really choked out with a lot of dense brush. There's mountain laurel in here, but there are also fire-intolerant species that are out competing these few residual pitch pines that are left. It's been hit hard by gypsy moth, so we've lost a lot of the oak that was there in the overstory, and that oak has not been replacing itself. Very little browse available. This is really a degraded habitat situation. It's very encouraging when we see the potential for improvement with just one fire. Sending one fire, restoring it back into that ecosystem, and the results we get. You can see the flush growth here. We actually have some data on this, and as far as browse availability, there's a 400% increase in browse availability for deer. From this condition to this condition. So 400% increase in available browse. That means this landscape has a lot higher carrying capacity for something like whitetails. And there are a lot of native plants that are just appearing in there out of the seed bank. We've got healthy scrub oak. We start to see a lot of native grasses coming back just after one fire in our restoration process. A few more examples here. Something really neat that we're starting to see that hasn't occurred for a long time is pitch pine is regenerating itself. I pointed out in the last picture, the few remaining pitch pines. When they die, they didn't have anything to replace them. But when we bring fire back in and clear out that understory and make conditions right for pitch pine regeneration, we're seeing it come back in. And pitch pines actually have a level of cone serotiny, meaning that they need the heat from those fires to release their seeds from the cones. So pretty neat to see pitch pine regenerating on the landscape. This is an area in the Poconos region. You can see here blueberry and scrub oak and pitch pine. This was almost turned into an industrial park. Now it's an area under restoration with fire. Beautiful place. And you can see elk here just a couple days after a prescribed burn up on State Game Lands 311. Elk enjoying some of that succulent new growth. And I will say, when I was in Mississippi, I'm an avid turkey hunter, and all the old turkey hunters in Mississippi always carried some kind of a slate gray outfit in with their hunting gear, and if the Forest Service was burning, they were sure to hunt those areas even though they were charred and black. And Pennsylvania hunters are starting to get the hint about this too. This is a gobbler that was killed a couple springs ago while the smoke was still coming out of a burn unit. So definitely a great opportunity to improve hunting opportunity on our game lands. And fire is something that we can do at a landscape scale. I mentioned we have 800,000 acres in need of restoration. So fire is something we can apply safely over a large area. And here again, you can see the road and fire break network that we're using to implement fire safely here in a controlled situation. Right here in 2009, so this is the amount of acreage that we've been burning on the state game lands and hunter access cooperators with the Game Commission here in PA. So Prescribed Burn Practices Act signed into law right here. Of course, we had a few years of getting our training in order, making sure we had qualified people, the equipment we needed, and we've been increasing our acreage burned ever since. This year, just in the spring, we also do some late summer and fall burning, so we're hoping this will be between 9,000 and 10,000 acres this year. There's a lot to do out there on the landscape, so we're hoping that by the year 2020, we'll be burning about 20,000 acres a year on our way to trying to improve the health of that 800,000 acres of habitat we have out there on the game lands. And with that, I think we can field some questions.
All right, thanks. So feel free to write some questions in, and we'll let Ben handle those. In the meantime, maybe you could tell us a little bit about maybe like the burn boss's role when you're out on a site.
Yeah, sure. The burn boss role, that's the person that's in charge of the whole operation. It's a person with a lot of experience, a lot of training, hundreds of hours of classroom training, and hundreds, even thousands of hours of experience on the fire line. So that burn boss is a critical person in making sure that burn is carried out safely.
So what kind of things go into making the decision whether or not we burn today?
We're all diehard weather watchers. That's the biggest thing. Do we have the right weather conditions to burn? Is it dry enough but not too dry? Are winds low enough that we can safely control that fire? So weather is absolutely paramount in the whole decision. And we also have to make sure that we have enough crew members to staff the fire, enough equipment. What are those fuel conditions? How dry has it been in the preceding weeks? There are a lot of things that go into that decision whether a day is a good burn day.
Okay. How do we tell people that we're burning?
So locally, we'll do press releases notifying the media. And since there are such detailed weather conditions that have to be met, as you might imagine, with a weather forecast, you can't be sure of those conditions much more than about 24 hours out before the burn. So what we call our go, no-go decision usually comes out sometime the afternoon before we're going to burn. We have to wait that long to make sure our weather conditions are going to be what we need. So at that point, we will send out a go. It will show up in press releases for local media. And something we just started doing, you can check out our website, is we have a real-time online map, and that map will indicate, for example, this spring, what areas we may burn, and at the point where we're going to burn those the next day, then you can go to that map and it will that area will come up. It'll say imminent. So a burn unit will either be on the map as planned, imminent, or it will show up that we had already burned it. So turkey hunters, for example, that are interested in going up to hunt on, say, Game Lands 210 the next day, can get on our website and see if we're planning to burn that next day. Or they could get on there to see if maybe we burned last week, and it would be a good place to go hunt. That's been a really good tool for letting the public know when and where we're burning.
Excellent. All right, we have some questions rolling in here.
Okay, cool.
Let's see. Ben asks, during prescribed fires, is there any measure taken to protect the mature trees in the burn area?
Oh, yeah, great question. Absolutely. So that comes into that whole weather prescription. So our burn plan talks a lot about what are our goals and objectives for that area. And in a lot of cases, we want to try to minimize the number of overstory trees that we kill. So in those cases, we have to really watch our weather parameters, make sure it's not too hot a day, and we can also adjust how we burn that unit to adjust the fire intensity when we're burning. Now, I will also say on that note, there are cases where we don't want to kill overstory trees, but there are some cases where we do want to kill overstory trees. So if we're trying to open an area up to those savanna or woodland conditions, we may actually have a goal to kill some trees with fire to open that habitat up a bit and let more sunlight hit the ground.
Excellent. Joe wants to know, do you have any information about how your fire management has influenced others, such as private landowners, policymakers, or even colleagues?
How it's affected them.
How fire has influenced others. Maybe you can clarify a little bit, Joe? we have another question. Well, Joe maybe can give us some more information about, give us some more lead in how to answer his question. By burning in the spring, how are we worried about killing young wildlife, turkey, grouse on nests?
Yeah. So our primary burn window in the spring is early March into about mid-May, and certainly ground nesting birds are on the nest at that time, and we may disturb a few of those nests. So with turkeys and grouse, if we do burn over a nest at that time, they often do re-nest. And actually the research I did in Mississippi showed that in these low intensity fires, sometimes that nest wouldn't even be harmed. Another thing that comes into play is that the proportion of an overall landscape that we're burning in any spring is relatively small. So let's go again to Game Lands 210. If we burn 1,000 acres up there on that 12,000 acre Game Lands, you know, we're still under 10% of that whole land area. So our direct impacts that year will be relatively small compared to the long-term benefit of the habitat. But certainly some nests are destroyed, but with either the re-nesting, some nests not being harmed, and the proportion of land base we're working on, the benefits outweigh the negatives. You've got to break a few eggs to make an omelet.
Excellent. So Joe is clarifying influence attitudes or perhaps acreage.
Oh yeah, okay.
Does that help?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we first started, a lot of what we heard was you can't do this in Pennsylvania, and we've been trying to persevere and getting some burns on the landscape. We've been working hard to show people the results. We've held a series of workshops, and this again is what the Prescribed Fire Council is designed to do, that outreach component. And we have a lot of private landowners now. We're generating demand for burning on private lands. So absolutely, and we're always working with our partner agencies, other public landholders in the state, encouraging them to burn, signing into cooperative agreements so we can help each other. So yeah, we definitely feel like it's influencing other landowners.
Good deal. Are there any other questions you often get when you're out there?
I've got one right here.
Sure, go ahead.
How often do wildlife escape the fire? So yeah, I forgot to mention I got caught up in the nesting part, but we do often see even very young fawns getting out of the way of the fire. So our peak fawning date in Pennsylvania, I believe most of the fawns are born right around within a couple days of June 5th. We're wrapped up with our prescribed fire season usually before Memorial Day. At that point, the woods are too wet and leafed out and green to be able to burn anymore. So at the point where most of the fawns are being born, we're done burning. With that said, certainly some fawns are born in May while we're still out there, and we see them getting out in front of the flames without any problem.
That's great. All right, it looks like we are just about good to wrap it up, unless there's anything else you want to touch on.
No, those were great questions. Really appreciate everybody joining us for lunch today.
Awesome. All right. Well, this session has been recorded, and those of you that tuned in, you should receive an email shortly with a link to the recording. That should happen within the next few hours. And it will also be uploaded to the Game Commission's YouTube channel, hopefully by the end of the week. I'd like to thank Ben Jones for sharing his expertise and time with us today, and I'd like to thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us this afternoon, and hope you'll visit us again to learn more about Pennsylvania wildlife in upcoming webinars. Until then, we hope you're able to get outside and enjoy some of Pennsylvania's great outdoors.